Imagine Rome at the height of its power, where marble villas gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, and the empire's heartbeat pulsed through its forum. In this world, a child's laughter could vanish in an instant, replaced by the echo of ceremonial horns that signaled destiny or doom. A 10-year-old girl, no different from countless others, might be playing with her dolls in her family courtyard, the air filled with the scent of olives and smoke from nearby hearths. Her mother hums softly at her loom, weaving not just fabric but a fragile sense of security, while her father entertains merchants and clients, discussing trade routes that stretch from Spain to Syria. Then everything shatters. A procession enters the neighborhood. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's supreme priest, has arrived to select the next servant of the goddess Vesta. To ordinary eyes, this is a religious honor. To those who know better, it is a death sentence disguised as divine favor. The priest's gaze sweeps over the children gathered, measuring each one against an impossible standard. When his eyes settle on the young girl, time itself seems to freeze. He raises his staff, pronounces the fatal words, "This one serves Vesta," and her life as she knew it is erased. Her mother collapses in tears, begging silently for mercy that will never come. Her father stands motionless, aware that refusal would condemn the entire household. The child, still too young to grasp the magnitude of what has occurred, believes she has been chosen for glory. What she does not realize is that she has been sentenced to 30 years of enforced virginity, relentless surveillance, and punishments so brutal they were designed to crush not only the body but the spirit. Modern documentaries often describe these women as priestesses of immense respect, yet the truth, buried in fragments of Livy, Plutarch, and later chroniclers, reveals a system closer to institutionalized captivity. The Romans did not merely elevate young girls to holy office. They abducted them under a veil of ceremony. Families lived in terror of the priest's visit. Parents would conceal daughters with relatives in distant provinces, feign illnesses, or even smear ash and cosmetics to make them appear diseased or blemished. Anything to escape notice. To lose a daughter to the Vestals was not a triumph. It was a tragedy. The criteria themselves were mercilessly narrow. The girl had to be between 6 and 10 years old. Both parents needed to be alive, a sign of her symbolic wholeness. She must be the child of legitimate Roman marriage, free of physical defect, unmarred by scandal, and born into citizenship. The idea was clear. Only perfection, both legal and biological, could be surrendered to the goddess. And once chosen, there was no appeal, no escape. She was taken immediately from her family home, renamed, and absorbed into the cloistered life of the Atrium Vesti, the house of Vestals located beside the Forum. Writers of the era described the residence as resplendent, ornamental gardens, marble columns, and elegant chambers, but appearances deceived. In reality, it was a gilded cage. No matter the luxury, the walls were not avenues of freedom but barriers of control. The girl was no longer her parents' child, no longer even her own person. She had become property of the state and, more chillingly, of the goddess herself. Her every movement was watched, her letters censored, her inheritance rights revoked. The indoctrination began immediately with 3 sacred laws. First, perpetual virginity for 30 years, eliminating any hope of love, marriage, or family. Second, absolute obedience to the Pontifex Maximus and the College of Priests. Third, eternal guardianship of the sacred flame of Vesta, the symbolic fire that represented Rome's eternal survival. These laws were not mere religious guidelines. They were backed by punishments so grotesque that Roman crucifixions, already infamous for cruelty, seemed merciful by comparison. What unfolded was more than ritual service. It was systematic psychological conditioning. New initiates cried for days, begged to return home, or starved themselves in desperation. Senior Vestals would stand over them, repeating the chilling mantra that resistance was futile. The goddess had chosen, and suffering was sacred duty. The message was clear: you belong to us now forever. From a modern perspective, what Rome perfected here was nothing less than state-engineered psychological warfare. These girls were groomed to accept complete erasure of individuality, taught that any error, whether real or imagined, would provoke divine wrath expressed through human cruelty. And because their bodies were declared holy, they could not be executed like common criminals. Instead, the state devised punishments uniquely tailored to prolong suffering, while maintaining the illusion of sanctity. This paradox became the foundation of their torment: too sacred to kill, too valuable to free. This conditioning created lives lived in constant dread. Imagine the weight on a child who knew that if the sacred flame flickered out, she could be beaten into internal hemorrhage, her screams muffled, her blood hidden from sight. Imagine the terror of knowing that gossip alone could condemn her to suffocation in a buried chamber, with a loaf of bread and a lamp offered not as mercy but as mockery. Rome's greatest innovation was not architecture, aqueducts, or law. It was the construction of invisible prisons within human minds, where fear became chains and ritualized trauma ensured obedience. But this cruelty was not hidden from all. Ancient whispers tell us that sometimes the sacred flame was deliberately extinguished by authorities themselves, using religion as camouflage for political revenge. A Vestal could be punished not for negligence but for the ambitions of powerful men, sacrificed to preserve appearances of divine favor. These state-sanctioned tortures were not only acts of discipline, they were tools of power, reinforcing a system where women's bodies and lives were collateral in the empire's pursuit of control. The story of the Vestals, therefore, is not just about faith or ritual. It is about how civilizations weaponize religion to enforce obedience, how empires turn innocence into instruments of propaganda, and how the voices of the powerless are silenced beneath the weight of marble temples and sacred fires. Rome's legacy is often celebrated as law, order, and civilization. But in the lives of these girls, we see another legacy, one of manipulation, exploitation, and psychological destruction masquerading as divine will. And this is only the beginning. What you've heard so far is not the worst of their ordeal. For the Vestal virgins, the true horrors revealed themselves not in the moment of selection, but in the years and decades that followed, when mistakes, real or fabricated, brought punishments designed with a precision that defied human mercy. To understand Rome's brilliance and brutality, we must descend further into the darkness of these punishments, where law, religion, and cruelty intertwined into a system of control that scarred generations. The flame of Vesta was no ordinary fire. To Romans, it symbolized the heartbeat of the empire itself. If it burned, Rome lived. If it died, Rome's destiny was imperiled. That burden fell not on senators or generals, but on little girls cloistered away, whose trembling hands tended the fire day and night. For them, the flicker of a flame was not just ritual, it was survival. Any lapse, however small, meant accusations of negligence or moral corruption. And when the flame faltered, punishment arrived with terrifying swiftness. The verberatio, the dreaded beating in darkness, was perhaps the most infamous of these punishments. The condemned Vestal was led into a hidden chamber beneath the temple complex. There, she was stripped naked and bound to a wooden frame. The Pontifex Maximus himself, the same figure who had once selected her as a child, now stood as executioner of divine justice. But the cruelty was layered with ritual. She could not be allowed to scream, for her voice was considered sacred. A leather gag silenced her, trapping her cries of agony within. She could not be permitted to bleed openly, for her blood was holy. The rods used for striking were designed to cause massive internal damage while leaving the skin intact. Medical texts from antiquity describe deaths days later, organs ruptured, lungs filled with blood. Yet the official records listed causes like illness or divine displeasure. Rome meticulously preserved appearances. Outwardly, no violence had occurred. Inwardly, the victim's body was shattered. This combination of ritual secrecy and physical torment made verberatio a uniquely psychological weapon. The girl never knew when inspection of the flame might come. She lived in constant dread that one careless moment, one sudden draft, could bring torture beyond imagination. Imagine the toll. Anxiety so severe that hands shook when lifting even a small torch, sleep deprived from watching the eternal fire, minds consumed by the terror of the next accusation. Ancient writers noted that some Vestals aged visibly within months, their hair whitening, their bodies wasting from unrelenting stress. Today, psychologists would call this post-traumatic stress disorder. In Rome, it was simply called devotion, but the horror did not end with physical pain. The randomness of punishment amplified the cruelty. The flame could go out from natural causes, a gust of wind, a faulty brazier, even deliberate sabotage by Rome's enemies. Yet responsibility always fell on the Vestals. They were guilty by definition. Some historians suggest the flame was extinguished deliberately by authorities as a pretext to punish certain priestesses for political or personal reasons. In this way, the sacred flame became less a symbol of divinity than a tool of control. The cycle of trauma was carefully engineered. After verberatio, the wounded girl would be treated by temple physicians. But healing was not the goal. She was kept alive, her pain prolonged, her body deliberately left fragile. Each day she was reminded of her failure and told her suffering was deserved. The lesson was burned into her. Obedience was survival, error meant torment. Survivors of the beatings rarely resisted again. They became hollowed-out figures, moving with mechanical precision, their individuality erased. When we examine this through a modern lens, it becomes clear. Rome was not merely punishing mistakes, it was perfecting psychological warfare. By making punishment inevitable, unpredictable, and hidden under religious justification, the empire turned young women into living examples of submission. Citizens outside the temple saw only solemn priestesses guarding the eternal flame. They never witnessed the bloodless tortures that kept those priestesses compliant. But if ritualized beatings seem horrific, they pale beside Rome's treatment of Vestals accused of the ultimate crime, breaking their vow of chastity. This crime was called incestum, meaning pollution or desecration. and the punishment devised for it was unlike anything in the ancient world. It was not execution by sword, nor crucifixion, nor public burning. Rome claimed such things were unworthy of holy women. Instead, it invented something far worse: burial alive. The case of Oppia and Floronia in 216 BCE stands as one of the darkest examples. Both women were accused of incestum, not through evidence but through whispers and political rivalries. Their fate was sealed in secret trial before the College of Pontiffs. No defense was permitted, no witnesses called. The verdict was death, but carried out with ritual that cloaked cruelty in sanctity. At dawn, the condemned Vestal was dressed as a bride. She wore a white gown, her hair arranged with flowers, her veil covering her face. To the casual observer, it might appear she was going to her wedding. But this was no union with a man. It was a marriage to the grave. Her mouth was sealed with wax to prevent pleas that might move the crowd. A silent procession escorted her through the forum to the campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked, just outside Rome's walls. There, an underground chamber awaited. Workers had hollowed a small cell furnished with grim tokens of mercy: a bed, a lamp, a jug of water, a loaf of bread, a cup of milk. Rome declared that it was not killing her. The provisions proved on paper that she was being left to the gods' judgment, but everyone knew the truth. The lamp would burn out in hours. The food might last days, but the air would suffocate her long before. The descent itself was the cruelest part. She had to walk down into her tomb by her own will. Rome could not be seen forcing her. Once she stepped inside, the stairway was dismantled, the earth packed tight above her head. Within moments, the surface was smoothed as if nothing had been disturbed. The crowd dispersed. Silence returned. The Vestal was left alone in blackness, her breaths growing shallower as the air thinned. Whispers of horror lingered in Rome. Some claimed that scratching sounds were heard from beneath the ground in the days after such burials, fingernails clawing stone, muffled gasps for air. Whether true or legend, these stories amplified the terror for every remaining Vestal. For them, the message was clear. Even suspicion of impurity could mean living death, erased from memory, denied burial rites, and forbidden to be mourned. Their names were wiped from public record as though they had never existed. Burial alive was not only punishment, it was erasure, the complete annihilation of identity. To die was bad enough, to be denied remembrance was worse. In Rome, memory was immortality. To erase someone's name was to condemn them to a second death, a final obliteration beyond flesh. For Vestals accused of incestum, this was their ultimate fate: disappearance into silence. This reveals something chilling about Rome's psychology. By clothing cruelty in ritual, the empire turned horror into spectacle, fear into obedience. It was not enough to kill. Rome had to ensure that each punishment reinforced its authority, binding not just the body but the mind of every citizen who watched. The flame, the beatings, the burials, these were not accidents of history. They were deliberate systems of control. And yet, the story does not end with punishment alone. For those rare women who survived 30 years of service, freedom was promised. But what did that freedom truly mean? Could someone conditioned by decades of fear, isolation, and trauma ever rejoin the world outside? Could they ever live as ordinary Romans again? That question leads us to the cruelest deception of all, the so-called liberation of the Vestals, a freedom that existed only on parchment, never in reality. After 30 long years of service, the Roman state promised its Vestal virgins freedom. On parchment, this appeared as a moment of triumph. At last, they could shed their white veils, reclaim personal identity, and return to the world of ordinary women. Ceremonies were staged in the Forum, celebrating their loyalty to the goddess and their guardianship of the eternal flame. Gifts of gold, dowries from the treasury, and the official right to marry were granted as tokens of gratitude. To the casual observer, this ending seemed almost noble. But peel back the facade and one sees a final act of cruelty, freedom that was hollow, poisoned, and tragically meaningless. Consider the mathematics of time. A girl chosen at age 8 would leave the service at 38. In Roman society, women were typically married in their teens, often before 20, and began bearing children immediately. By the late 30s, most were seen as past childbearing age. Fertility had waned, and their value within Rome's patriarchal marriage market had diminished. The freedom to marry was a promise delivered too late, when no one desired them. It was like unlocking a prison cell after the prisoner had grown too old and frail to walk away. Even more damning were the cultural stigmas. Romans believed that 30 years of sacred duty fundamentally transformed these women. They were no longer considered ordinary. Some thought they had been touched by divine forces in ways that made them dangerous to common households. Others feared divine retribution, believing that marrying a former Vestal would taint a family line. The stigma turned freedom into exile. The tragic case of Claudia Quinta illustrates this with haunting clarity. After completing her service in 43 CE, she was awarded a generous dowry and introduced to several respectable suitors. Yet time and again, engagements collapsed. Families consulted religious authorities, who declared that marrying a former Vestal would bring dishonor and perhaps anger the gods. Claudia, who had spent 3 decades serving the empire with unswerving devotion, was abandoned. She lived the remainder of her life in isolation outside Rome, unmarried, childless, and forgotten. Her funeral was attended not by family or friends, but by paid mourners, her grave unmarked, her legacy erased. Economic betrayal compounded social exile. Promised pensions and financial rewards often failed to materialize. Bureaucratic corruption, shifting political priorities, or deliberate neglect meant that many women emerged from service destitute. They could not inherit from their families, having been legally severed from their bloodlines upon initiation. They had no husbands, no children, no households of their own. In a society where survival depended on family networks, they stood alone, socially dismembered, economically crippled. And then came the hidden scars, the psychological wounds. Modern psychology would describe their symptoms as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and severe anxiety. Ancient accounts, though lacking clinical vocabulary, described women waking in terror from nightmares of the sacred flame extinguishing, compulsively checking locks, refusing physical touch, or collapsing into paranoid rants about divine punishment. Some former Vestals wandered the streets proclaiming visions and rituals, their minds broken by decades of institutional trauma. Historians labeled them victims of sacred dementia, sacred madness. For others, isolation became voluntary. Accustomed to a lifetime of surveillance and ritual, they could not adjust to freedom. They shut themselves in small homes, mimicking the cloister of the Atrium Vesti, recreating solitude as though freedom itself were unbearable. A few attempted suicide, unable to reconcile the promise of liberation with the reality of emptiness. Perhaps most tragically, some survivors became supervisors, brought back into the temple as advisors or guardians. They perpetuated the cycle, instructing new generations of girls in the very practices that had destroyed their own youth. It was institutional memory weaponized, the abused becoming the enforcers, ensuring the cycle of trauma endured for centuries. Seen in full, the so-called liberation of Vestals was not freedom, but a final deception. Rome gave them back their lives only after stripping them of everything that made life meaningful: youth, family, fertility, belonging. The empire turned 30 years of sacred service into a lifetime of erasure. When we compare this to broader Roman society, the cruelty becomes sharper. Male priests retired with honors, political connections, and influence. Retired generals were celebrated, senators remembered, even gladiators granted fame. The Vestals, women who had safeguarded the fire believed to embody Rome's survival, were cast aside, their existence deemed too tainted, too inconvenient for ordinary life. They were Rome's expendable saints, used and discarded by an empire that masked brutality with ritual. This raises a broader, unsettling question. Why did Rome design such a system at all? What purpose was served by transforming innocent girls into hollow instruments of obedience? The answer lies not only in religion but in politics. The cult of Vesta was not just about fire. It was about control. By seizing children from prominent families, Rome bound those families' loyalties to the state. By creating a caste of women too sacred to touch yet too fragile to resist, the empire reinforced its ideology of male dominance and religious supremacy. The Vestals were propaganda made flesh, living reminders that Rome's survival required obedience, sacrifice, and silence, especially from women. And yet, beneath this machinery of cruelty, there are flickers of humanity. Some Vestals resisted quietly, passing coded letters to their families despite bans. Some forged friendships in captivity, offering each other comfort. And some, like the legendary Tuccia, used defiance cloaked in miracle, claiming divine proof of innocence by carrying water in a sieve to challenge their accusers. These small acts of rebellion, though rare, reveal that even within Rome's iron grip, human spirit endured. The story of the Vestals is not just about Rome's cruelty. It is about how power systems weaponize innocence, how institutions disguise control as holiness, and how individuals caught in such systems struggle to preserve fragments of their identity. It is a story as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago, echoing in every culture that uses purity, sacrifice, or honor as tools to bind women's lives to causes beyond their choosing. As we continue deeper into this narrative, we must confront the chilling truth. The punishments endured by the Vestals were not relics of a distant past. They were prototypes of systems that have resurfaced in countless guises across history. Systems where ideology cloaks cruelty, where sanctity conceals exploitation, and where power feeds on the silence of the powerless. Rome's genius, and its horror, was its ability to transform cruelty into ritual, to make suffering appear not as oppression but as divine necessity. The Vestal virgins stood at the center of this paradox. They were simultaneously exalted as sacred figures and degraded as expendable instruments of state control. Their torment was not the work of a few sadistic priests, but a carefully designed system that endured for nearly 1,000 years. To understand how it lasted so long, we must examine the psychological machinery that sustained it. From the moment a girl entered the atrium vesti, her identity was dismantled. Her birth name was stripped away, replaced by a title marking her as property of the goddess. She was forbidden to inherit from her family, forbidden to write unsupervised letters, forbidden to leave the temple without escort. Isolation was not accidental, it was policy. By severing all ties to her past, Rome ensured that her loyalty could belong only to the institution. This is what modern scholars call total control environments, systems designed to reprogram individuals by controlling every aspect of their lives. The Vestals lived in one of the earliest recorded examples. The rules themselves reinforced the architecture of fear. Perpetual virginity was not simply a vow of chastity. It was a tool to sever them from the most fundamental human bonds: marriage, motherhood, intimacy. Absolute obedience to the Pontifex Maximus made them answerable to a single male authority, with unchecked power over their fates. And guardianship of the sacred flame placed them under constant pressure, forcing them to equate their personal worth with Rome's very survival. To fail was not just personal error, it was cosmic treason. Yet what truly cemented compliance was the unpredictability of punishment. A girl never knew if the flame might be extinguished by accident, or if rumors might swirl into accusations of incestum. She could be perfect in her duties and still face terror. This constant uncertainty eroded her sense of agency, creating what psychologists today call learned helplessness, the condition where victims no longer resist abuse because they believe resistance changes nothing. Rome had engineered an environment where fear became self-sustaining. The secrecy surrounding punishments amplified the terror. Ordinary Romans saw Vestals walking solemnly in rituals, draped in white, appearing serene. They did not see the darkness beneath the temple where gags silenced screams, or the burial pits where wax sealed mouths before suffocation. To the public, Vestals symbolized purity and divine protection. To the women themselves, the temple was a labyrinth of hidden chambers of pain. This dual reality, the sacred facade and the hidden torment, gave Rome plausible deniability. Cruelty thrived because it was invisible. But why target women in this way? Why elevate them only to enslave them in silence? The answer lies in Rome's deep-seated anxieties about female power. Women's bodies in Roman culture were seen as both essential and dangerous. Essential for producing heirs, dangerous for their potential to destabilize social order through passion, desire, or disobedience. The Vestal system neutralized this threat. By demanding virginity, Rome contained sexuality. By enforcing obedience, it contained independence. By threatening annihilation for failure, it ensured silence. The Vestals embodied Rome's obsession with controlling women, not only in body but in spirit. At the same time, their existence served political propaganda. Families whose daughters were chosen gained both prestige and a permanent bond to the state. It was impossible to rebel against an empire that literally held your child in sacred captivity. The presence of Vestals at public ceremonies reassured the masses that Rome enjoyed divine favor. The cult of Vesta projected stability in a world of constant wars, famines, and revolts. The women themselves were reduced to symbols, human sacrifices in slow motion, consumed by a system that valued appearances over humanity. When we step back and compare, the Vestal institution was not an anomaly of ancient superstition. It was part of a pattern seen across empires. States throughout history have exploited women's purity, whether as guardians of honor, bearers of lineage, or symbols of religious devotion. The idea is always the same. By controlling women's bodies, you control the family, and by controlling the family, you control society. Rome simply codified this logic with brutal precision. Yet there were moments when the system cracked. Whispers of rebellion survive in the record. Stories of girls who tried to escape, of families who bribed officials to spare their daughters, of accusations fabricated for political purposes that backfired. The famous story of Tuccia, the Vestal accused of incestum, reveals the thin line between oppression and defiance. When charged with impurity, she demanded to prove her innocence by carrying water in a sieve from the Tiber River to the temple. According to legend, the water miraculously stayed, vindicating her. Whether miracle or myth, the story reflects a desperate yearning for justice in a system designed to deny it. What makes these stories so haunting is their universality. Replace the marble temples with modern institutions, the sacred flame with ideological purity, and the punishments with social shaming or political imprisonment, and the pattern endures. Systems of power continue to cloak control in sacred or noble language, turning human beings into symbols and obedience into virtue. The legacy of the Vestals, then, is not confined to Rome. It is a warning about what happens when societies mask cruelty as necessity, when the suffering of the few is justified as the salvation of the many, when women's lives are sacrificed on the altar of order. Rome's empire has long since fallen, but the mechanisms it perfected, the manipulation of fear, the erasure of identity, the sanctification of suffering, still echo through history. As we move deeper into this story, we will explore not just the punishments themselves, but their aftermath. What did it mean to live under constant surveillance? What became of the women who survived decades of enforced sanctity? And how did their silence shape the memory of Rome itself? The answers reveal not only the cruelty of an empire, but the resilience and tragedy of the human spirit caught within its grip. To live as a Vestal virgin was to live under constant surveillance, where even the smallest gestures were scrutinized for meaning. Imagine walking through marble corridors, every footstep echoing against walls that seemed to whisper reminders of your captivity. The older priestesses watched constantly, their eyes trained to detect hesitation, weakness, or doubt. A dropped torch, a tremor of the hand while feeding the fire, even a distracted glance could be noted and remembered. Nothing was private. Every action became a test, every breath a potential offense. The sacred flame itself was both guardian and tyrant. It was said to embody the very soul of Rome. If it flickered, the empire trembled. For the Vestal tending it, the fire was less a symbol than a nightmare. Each night she must rise to check its embers, relight its strength, and protect it from drafts. But the fear was never simply of failure. It was of accusation. For in Rome, perception carried as much weight as reality. If the flame died, even by chance, suspicion automatically fell upon the guardians. Guilt was assumed and punishment was inevitable. This knowledge gnawed at the girls, eroding their sense of control, driving them into perpetual anxiety. The architecture of the Atrium Vestae reinforced this environment. The residence was elegant, adorned with gardens, statues, and flowing fountains, but beneath its beauty lay a structure of confinement. High walls isolated the Vestals from ordinary citizens. Their chambers were arranged to ensure oversight, and even their paths to the temple were designed as processions, not private walks. The effect was a life of ritualized display. Their every movement was public performance, reminding Rome that its daughters were chained to the goddess in obedience. In moments of ceremony, the Vestals appeared powerful. They sat in special seats at games, enjoyed honors denied to other women, and were escorted by lictors, official guards like senators or magistrates. But these privileges were masks. They projected authority outward while concealing subjugation within. It is the same paradox seen in countless regimes. The figurehead elevated as symbol while simultaneously enslaved in reality. For many Vestals, this duality fractured the self. To the outside world, they were embodiments of purity, serenity, and divine grace. Inside, they were children forced to navigate a labyrinth of fear. Some clung to obedience, believing compliance might protect them. Others retreated inward, suppressing their emotions until they became numb. Ancient records hint at breakdowns: girls who refused food, who wept for months, who screamed at night until silenced by older priestesses. These moments were hidden, never spoken of publicly, but they reveal the immense psychological toll of this existence. Rome's leaders understood this toll and exploited it. By breaking individuality early, they created servants incapable of rebellion. The system's cruelty was not a flaw but a feature. A young Vestal who had endured the terror of verberatio or witnessed the burial of a peer learned quickly that resistance was futile. Submission was survival. Thus, the temple produced not only guardians of a flame but examples of obedience for all Rome. If even the sacred daughters of the state could be crushed into silence, what hope had ordinary women or men for defiance? And yet, despite the machinery of control, the system was vulnerable to corruption. The power to accuse a Vestal of negligence or impurity rested in the hands of priests and political elites. This made the women pawns in games far larger than themselves. Rumors of incestum often surfaced in times of political crisis, when powerful men sought scapegoats to explain military defeats or natural disasters. In 114 BCE, for instance, 3 Vestals, Emilia, Licinia, and Marcia, were accused of breaking their vows. Historians suspect the charges were politically motivated, a way to deflect blame for Rome's struggles abroad. The trials ended in 2 executions, despite thin evidence proving that piety and justice were secondary to political convenience. What makes this particularly chilling is the silence surrounding the accused. They could not speak in their own defense. Their voices, deemed sacred, were never heard in trial. Only accusations mattered. Only verdicts mattered. Their truth was irrelevant. In this way, Rome weaponized silence itself. The absence of a voice became proof of guilt, and the act of being accused became indistinguishable from being condemned. This weaponization of silence did not end at death. Vestals punished for incestum were erased from the record, their names stricken, their families forbidden to mourn. To live forgotten was tragedy. To die erased was annihilation. Rome ensured that their suffering echoed not through memory, but through absence. They became shadows, warnings to others, and their disappearance was itself propaganda. Rome erases those who fail it. Yet, despite the silence, fragments of their humanity slip through the cracks of history. Ancient writers record rare instances of compassion, temple servants who wept while sealing burial chambers, families who left offerings at forbidden graves, whispers of girls who begged for one last glance at the sky. These fleeting moments remind us that beneath the machinery of empire, real children suffered, real families grieved, and real lives were broken. This dual reality, the grandeur of Rome and the terror it concealed, forces us to confront a disturbing truth. Civilizations are often judged by their monuments, but the true measure lies in the human cost behind them. The Colosseum, the aqueducts, the Forum, all symbols of Roman greatness, were built on systems of control that devoured the vulnerable. The Vestals were not the only victims, but their fate epitomizes how far Rome was willing to go to maintain order and power. As we move further into this story, we must examine not only what Rome did to these women, but what it reveals about the empire itself. For the treatment of the Vestals was not an isolated cruelty. It was a reflection of Rome's deepest values: control through fear, order through silence, and power cloaked in ritual. And it is in these values, more than in any marble monument, that the true legacy of Rome is found. The story of the Vestal virgins ultimately exposes not just the plight of a few chosen girls, but the mechanics of an empire that thrived on fear, ritual, and silence. Their existence was engineered to serve as both sacred symbol and political tool, a human reminder that Rome's survival depended on absolute obedience. But what makes this system especially sinister is how effectively it erased individuality, replacing human lives with instruments of propaganda. To the Roman public, the Vestals embodied purity. They were paraded at festivals, granted special privileges, and seated in honored places during games. Their appearance in public reassured citizens that Rome still enjoyed divine favor. But this spectacle concealed a different reality. Behind closed temple doors, the very same women lived under the threat of torture, burial, and erasure. It is a chilling example of how power can manipulate appearances, presenting control as honor, subjugation as sanctity. One of the most striking aspects of the Vestal system is its longevity. From the monarchy of early Rome through the Republic and into the height of the empire, the institution persisted for nearly a millennium. Why did no one rebel? Why did no family refuse? The answer lies in the intertwining of religion and politics. For Romans, the gods were not abstract. They were forces that decided war, harvest, and survival. To resist the will of the Pontifex Maximus was to risk divine punishment, not only for oneself, but for one's entire family. Fear of the gods was reinforced by fear of the state, creating a trap from which escape was impossible. At the same time, families whose daughters were chosen could not openly resist. To protest was to insult the goddess and invite suspicion of impiety, a dangerous charge in a society where religion and politics were inseparable. Some even convinced themselves to interpret the abduction as honor, rationalizing their loss as the price of loyalty to Rome. It was a psychological sleight of hand that allowed the system to endure. And yet, beneath this facade, the empire's leaders understood the cruelty of what they imposed. That is why punishments were hidden, trials conducted in secrecy, and victims erased from records. Rome did not want citizens to see the cost of its purity rituals too clearly. The illusion had to be preserved, that the Vestals lived in privilege, that their suffering was voluntary, that their deaths were divine justice rather than human cruelty. By controlling narrative as tightly as they controlled the women themselves, the state protected its legitimacy. But history, even when censored, leaves fragments. Accounts of Vestals like Appia, Floronia, and Claudia Quinta expose cracks in the facade. They show that Rome's system was not flawless but fragile, reliant on silence and manipulation. When rumors of cruelty reached the people, unease spread. Some historians argue that scandals surrounding Vestals in the late Republic contributed to Rome's broader crisis of faith in its institutions. If even the keepers of the sacred flame could be accused, punished, and erased for political convenience, what did that say about the integrity of Rome's laws and leaders? This dynamic is not unique to Rome. Across history, regimes have relied on symbols of purity and obedience to stabilize their rule. Medieval Europe cloaked women in convents. Dynastic China bound women's feet to display control over their bodies. Even modern states have demanded sacrifices in the name of ideology, turning individuals into vessels of national or religious virtue. In every case, the logic is the same. Control the private, the intimate, and the powerless, and you control the public, the powerful, and the state itself. The Vestals were simply Rome's most enduring expression of this strategy. What makes their story resonate so strongly today is not just the brutality of their punishments, but the sophistication of the system behind them. Rome did not need mass executions to maintain order. It needed only the spectacle of ritualized cruelty, applied sparingly but with devastating effect. A single burial alive silenced an entire generation of Vestals. A single beating in darkness reminded them all of their fragility. The empire's genius was to weaponize fear so thoroughly that the victims enforced their own obedience. And yet, despite everything, the human spirit sometimes resisted. Stories like Tuccia's miraculous sieve may have been mythologized, but they reflect a deep yearning for justice in a world designed to suppress it. These legends gave hope that the goddess might intervene, that truth might surface, that even within Rome's iron grip, divine mercy could overturn human cruelty. Whether or not the miracles were real mattered less than the fact that they were told. They were whispers of defiance against an empire that demanded silence. Ultimately, the Vestal system reminds us that civilizations are not judged only by their monuments, but by the lives consumed to build them. Rome gave the world roads, laws, and literature, but it also gave us the image of a young girl buried alive, erased from memory, punished not for crime, but for being caught in the machinery of power. That image forces us to ask, what price are societies willing to pay for stability, and how often is that price exacted from those least able to resist? As we continue this journey, we must confront the most haunting aspect of all, the false promise of freedom. For Rome did not merely punish its Vestals in life, it condemned them in survival. Even those who endured 30 years of service discovered that liberty, when finally granted, was nothing more than another prison without walls. The so-called freedom of the Vestals after 30 years of service was perhaps the cruelest deception of all. On the surface, it was framed as a reward, liberation from the temple, public ceremonies of gratitude, financial compensation, and the right to marry. Rome projected the image of benevolence, as though the state had simply borrowed their youth and was now returning them to ordinary life with honor. But reality tells a darker story, one where freedom was an illusion, and survival beyond the temple was often more terrifying than captivity itself. By the time a Vestal left her post, she was typically in her late 30s or early 40s. In Roman society, this was well past the age at which most women married and bore children. Fertility had diminished, and with it her prospects for marriage. The dowries Rome provided, though theoretically generous, were meaningless when no suitors wanted a wife who had been cloistered for 3 decades. A society that exalted her as sacred while she served now viewed her as tainted, unnatural, even cursed. She had become a relic of divine machinery, respected in ritual, rejected in reality. The case of Claudia Quinta is emblematic. After leaving the service, she was presented with opportunities to marry respectable men. Yet each engagement collapsed under pressure from families who feared divine wrath. They believed that sharing a bed with a former Vestal might pollute their bloodlines or provoke the goddess's anger. Claudia, who had spent her entire life serving the fire that symbolized Rome's survival, found herself cast aside. She lived her remaining years in isolation, childless and forgotten, her story a chilling reminder that Rome's rewards were often empty promises. Financial independence, too, was an illusion. While Vestals were promised stipends and pensions, these were frequently reduced, delayed, or withheld entirely due to shifting political winds or corruption in the treasury. And because they had been severed from their families legally at the time of selection, they had no right to inherit property or wealth. Many emerged into a world where they owned nothing, had no family network to rely upon, and lacked the skills to sustain themselves. What use was money, even if delivered, when the stigma of their past barred them from social integration? Worse still were the psychological scars. A girl raised under constant surveillance, stripped of autonomy, conditioned by punishments and rituals, could not easily reintegrate into society. Imagine stepping into the bustling forum after 30 years of controlled silence, merchants shouting prices, crowds pressing in, children laughing freely. For someone who had lived half a lifetime in ritualized fear, this sensory chaos was overwhelming. Many former Vestals withdrew, unable to bear the unpredictability of ordinary life. Ancient sources speak of women plagued by nightmares, waking in terror that the sacred flame had gone out. Others compulsively checked locks and lamps, as though still guarding against divine wrath. Some refused physical touch altogether, unable to endure intimacy after decades of enforced virginity. Modern psychology would recognize these as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Rome, however, dismissed them as eccentricities or madness. Some former Vestals wandered the streets in delusion, proclaiming visions and divine messages, what historians later called sacred madness. They were pitied, ridiculed, or ignored, their trauma recast as religious mania. And for some, captivity became the only life they knew. Unable to function outside, they returned to the Atrium Vesti as advisors or guardians of new initiates. In doing so, they perpetuated the very cycle of abuse they had endured, training fresh generations of girls to suppress individuality, accept surveillance, and fear mistakes. The institution thus sustained itself not only through coercion, but through survivors who had been broken into compliance, their trauma weaponized into obedience. Seen in this light, Rome's liberation of its Vestals was a cruel mirage. It promised life but delivered exile. It offered honor but ensured stigma. It granted money but imposed poverty. It opened the gates of freedom only to reveal emptiness on the other side. What Rome returned to these women was not the life they had lost, but a hollow existence stripped of family, fertility, and identity. And yet, Rome celebrated the system as sacred, essential, and just. This contradiction speaks volumes about the empire's priorities. It did not matter what became of the women once their usefulness ended. What mattered was that the institution endured, that the flame continued, that the illusion of divine protection remained intact. In this sense, the Vestals were not individuals at all. They were placeholders in a ritual machine that could discard and replace them at will. When judged by its monuments, Rome appears magnificent. Arches, aqueducts, amphitheaters still stand after millennia. But judged by its treatment of the Vestals, Rome reveals another truth, that its glory was built not only on military conquest and engineering genius, but on the silent suffering of those it erased. These women were the invisible foundations of Roman stability, and their freedom, when finally granted, was not liberation but abandonment. As we push further into this story, we must ask, what does it mean for an empire to thrive while consuming its own daughters? And more importantly, what echoes of this system remain in the ways modern societies treat those sacrificed in the name of order, honor, or tradition? To grasp the full horror of the Vestal system, we must see beyond individual stories and recognize it as a mechanism of statecraft. Rome was not merely managing religion, it was perfecting a method of social control. The Vestals were a carefully engineered symbol of purity, and their suffering was woven into the empire's political fabric. By elevating them publicly and destroying them privately, Rome demonstrated both its divine authority and its capacity for absolute dominance. The psychological warfare inflicted upon these girls was not incidental, it was deliberate. Modern scholars often compare the system to experiments in breaking the human spirit. The unpredictability of punishment, the denial of family bonds, and the constant reminder that their worth depended on flawless performance created a cycle of compliance that lasted decades. The result was a generation of women whose entire sense of identity revolved around service to the state. This was trauma weaponized into loyalty. Consider how Rome structured the punishments themselves. The verberatio, the beating administered in darkness, was not public spectacle but private terror. Unlike crucifixions, which were staged to intimidate the masses, this punishment was designed to silence and break the victim alone. It served no propagandistic function. It was purely disciplinary, a ritual of fear performed in secret chambers to ensure absolute obedience among the initiated. By contrast, the burial alive of women accused of incestum was public theater. It paraded the condemned through the forum in bridal attire, reminding citizens of the price of impurity. This duality, private terror for control within, public horror for control without, illustrates how precisely Rome calibrated its system of repression. The genius of this structure lay in its efficiency. Rome did not need mass executions or widespread violence. A handful of punishments, applied strategically, sustained centuries of compliance. One burial alive silenced dozens of Vestals for generations. One verberatio scarred a girl so deeply that her obedience became self-enforcing. The system did not merely punish, it taught victims to police themselves. And in this way, the empire created living monuments of fear, as effective as any wall or legion. It is tempting to dismiss these cruelties as relics of an ancient, superstitious age. But the logic behind them persists. Throughout history, institutions have cloaked violence in the language of sanctity, purity, or necessity. Medieval convents isolated women under vows of chastity. Colonial powers abducted children in the name of civilization. Totalitarian regimes in the 20th century staged show trials and forced confessions under the guise of justice. The mechanisms change, but the underlying pattern, control through ritualized suffering, remains the same. The Vestal virgins were among the earliest and most enduring examples of this universal strategy. What is perhaps most tragic is how normalized it became. To most Romans, the system was not cruel but sacred. Citizens saw the Vestals as honored, chosen, blessed. They did not witness the gags, the hidden beatings, the suffocating chambers beneath the earth. To them, the rituals of burial and punishment were divine justice, not state violence. The brilliance of Rome's cruelty was its invisibility, making oppression look like holiness, making victims appear as volunteers. Even freedom, as we've seen, was designed to reinforce this illusion. By staging ceremonies for retiring Vestals, Rome projected an image of benevolence, masking the reality of exile and psychological collapse. This dual narrative allowed the institution to survive for centuries without revolt. The victims themselves, broken by trauma, rarely resisted, and society at large never questioned the sanctity of their suffering. It is a reminder that the most effective systems of oppression are those that convince everyone, including the oppressed, that they are necessary. And yet, fragments of resistance linger in history. The story of Tuccia carrying water in a sieve, the whispered accounts of scratching beneath burial sites, the rare instances of families mourning in secret, all suggest that human defiance never vanished completely. Even within Rome's iron grip, there were cracks. These stories, whether literal or mythologized, kept alive the memory that the Vestals were not divine symbols but human beings. Their humanity is what Rome tried hardest to erase. By stripping them of names, families, and futures, the empire sought to transform them into vessels of ritual alone. But memory resists erasure. Today, when we tell their stories, we restore the individuality that Rome denied. We remember them not as faceless priestesses, but as children taken from their homes, women who trembled under the gaze of priests, human beings who suffered and endured. The deeper lesson lies here. Civilizations are remembered not only for what they build, but for what they destroy. Rome's roads, laws, and aqueducts endure, but so too does the legacy of silence imposed on its daughters. The Vestals remind us that behind every monument of power are human lives consumed in its shadow. As we approach the final stretch of this narrative, we must confront the ultimate truth. The Vestal system was not an aberration but a blueprint. Its methods of control, ritualized punishment, symbolic erasure, the manipulation of purity, recur throughout human history. And in recognizing these patterns, we see not just the cruelty of Rome, but the dangers that arise whenever societies disguise oppression as sanctity. The story of Rome's Vestal virgins reaches its darkest resonance when we examine what their suffering truly symbolized, not just for their own lives, but for the empire that consumed them. Their fate was never about individual failure or personal choice. It was about Rome's obsession with order, its relentless need to control not just its armies and provinces, but the very private lives of its citizens. And in this need, Rome revealed the essence of power itself, the ability to redefine cruelty as justice and suffering as sanctity. Each punishment, each ritual, was a message carved into the collective mind of the empire. The verberatio, the hidden beating in darkness, told every Vestal that mistakes would not be tolerated, that pain could descend without warning. The burial alive screamed to the public that Rome would annihilate impurity, that even whispers of defilement would be smothered beneath the earth. And the so-called liberation after 30 years revealed a cruel irony. Survival itself was no escape, for life beyond the temple was another prison, one built of exile, stigma, and invisible scars. What is striking is how effective this system was in reinforcing Rome's hierarchy. The Vestals were women elevated above all others, yet utterly powerless. They could ride in carriages, sit in honored places, and influence rituals, but their bodies and lives were not their own. They embodied a paradox, exalted in symbol, erased in substance. This paradox was not a contradiction to Rome, it was the point. By holding these women in both reverence and captivity, Rome demonstrated its absolute mastery over human life. The silence surrounding their suffering was as powerful as the punishments themselves. Citizens saw only ritual, never torment. Historians writing centuries later often glossed over the brutality, preferring to describe the Vestals as serene priestesses. Even modern retellings sometimes romanticize their role, speaking of privilege without acknowledging the pain. In this way, the empire's propaganda outlived the empire itself. The erasure Rome began has echoed across millennia. Yet, fragments remain. The scratched walls of burial sites, the trembling testimonies of ancient chroniclers, the whispered legends of miraculous defiance. These fragments resist the silence, reminding us that beneath the grandeur of empire were young girls who cried, families who grieved, and lives broken in the name of purity. They remind us that history is not only monuments and victories, but also shadows and absences. And it is in those absences that Rome's true legacy becomes visible. For the treatment of the Vestals was not an accident, it was a system. It taught Romans that women's bodies could be owned, that obedience was survival, that silence was virtue. It normalized institutional cruelty, cloaking it in divine approval. And once normalized, it seeped into every layer of society, shaping how Rome governed slaves, conquered peoples, even its own citizens. The Vestal system was not peripheral. It was central, a template for how power sustains itself through ritualized fear. This is why their story still matters, because the patterns are not ancient relics, they are alive. Across cultures and centuries, women have been cloistered in convents, veiled in silence, or punished for impurity in the name of gods, honor, or tradition. Children have been taken from families for their own good, stripped of identity in the name of civilization or progress. Institutions have hidden cruelty beneath rituals, whether through secret punishments, forced confessions, or erasures of memory. The mechanisms repeat, the labels change, but the logic remains the same: control through sanctity, domination through ritual. The Vestals remind us that the most dangerous tyrannies are not those that parade their violence openly, but those that sanctify it. When cruelty is wrapped in sacred language, it becomes invisible. When oppression is staged as ritual, it becomes unquestionable. Rome understood this truth better than most, and it wielded that understanding to maintain power for centuries. And so, when we remember the Vestal virgins, we must not romanticize them as symbols of Rome's piety. We must remember them as human beings whose lives were consumed to sustain an empire's illusion of divine favor. Their tears were real, their pain unrelenting, their erasure deliberate. To honor them is to strip away the facade and see the truth Rome tried to bury. In doing so, we recognize a broader duty: to question the systems in our own time that disguise exploitation as necessity, that turn human lives into symbols, that silence suffering behind walls of ritual. The Vestals lived, suffered, and died in Rome, but their story belongs to all of us, because the patterns that destroyed them still echo in the world we inhabit. The legacy of the Vestal virgins is not confined to the ruins of the Roman Forum or the scattered fragments of ancient chronicles. It persists because it embodies something larger than Rome itself: the human tendency to sanctify control, to disguise domination as devotion, to turn individuals into symbols in service of power. Rome's brilliance was not only in building roads and aqueducts, but in constructing systems of obedience so deeply embedded that they outlived the people they destroyed. The three punishments, ritual beatings, burial alive, and the false promise of freedom, form a progression of dehumanization. The verberatio destroyed the body's sense of safety, conditioning the victim to equate survival with obedience. The burial alive eliminated hope, showing that even the sacred could be annihilated for suspicion alone. And the so-called liberation after 30 years crushed the spirit entirely, revealing that even faithful service led only to exile, stigma, and isolation. Together, these punishments were not random acts of cruelty, but components of a system that perfected the art of breaking human beings without admitting to breaking them. What makes this system particularly chilling is how normalized it became. Citizens cheered the Vestals at festivals, admired their solemnity, and accepted their punishments as necessary for Rome's survival. Few questioned whether these women were victims. Instead, their suffering was interpreted as divine justice, their silence as willing sacrifice. The empire had succeeded in making cruelty invisible, embedding it so deeply in ritual that it appeared natural. And yet, the silence was never complete. Whispers survived. Rumors of deliberate extinguishing of the flame to justify punishment, stories of girls begging for release, legends of miracles like Tuccia's sieve. These fragments remind us that beneath the machinery of empire, human voices persisted, even if muted. They are faint echoes across millennia, but they testify that the Vestals were not willing saints. They were captives, enduring terror in the name of Rome's eternity. Modern scholars describe the system as an early form of institutionalized trauma. By isolating children at their most vulnerable age, severing them from family, and subjecting them to cycles of punishment and reward, Rome created individuals whose very identity was bound to the institution. They were unable to imagine a life beyond obedience. In this sense, the Vestals were part of a centuries-long experiment in controlling not only behavior but thought itself. And that experiment has echoes throughout history, from convents to re-education camps to ideologies that demand absolute purity. This is why their story is more than an archaeological curiosity. It is a mirror. It forces us to ask, how often do our own societies disguise cruelty as necessity? How often do we silence individuals by turning them into symbols? How often do we justify suffering in the name of tradition, honor, or divine will? The methods change, but the logic remains alarmingly familiar. To remember the Vestals properly, we must reject the sanitized narratives that portray them as honored priestesses. We must see them as human beings who lived, wept, and endured unimaginable suffering. They were not guardians of Rome's eternity by choice but by captivity. Their youth was stolen, their identities erased, their voices silenced. And yet by telling their stories now, we restore some of what Rome tried to erase. In the end, the Vestal virgins reveal the true cost of empire. Rome may have left us monuments, laws, and literature, but it also left us this warning, that the most dangerous tyrannies are not those that rule by force alone, but those that claim divine sanction for human cruelty. When suffering is cloaked in sacred language, when oppression masquerades as purity, the victims become invisible and the system becomes eternal. The lesson of the Vestals is that no empire, however powerful, is exempt from moral reckoning. Their suffering reminds us that greatness built on silence and sacrifice is fragile, and that the human cost, once forgotten, eventually resurfaces to demand recognition. To honor them is not only to mourn their pain, but to remain vigilant against the patterns of oppression that echo still in our world. Their flame has long since gone out, but their story burns as fiercely as ever, a fire that cannot be extinguished, a light on the shadows of power, and a reminder that behind every ritual of sanctity lies the question, who is paying the price? As the shadows of history stretch across millennia, the story of the Vestal virgins does not fade, it grows sharper, more urgent. Because in their silence, we hear the echoes of every society that has chosen to sacrifice the vulnerable for the illusion of order. Rome wrapped its cruelty in marble and ceremony, but at its heart lay the same logic seen throughout human history. To control the future, you must first control the innocent. The children Rome took between the ages of 6 and 10 were not chosen for their wisdom, nor for any mystical affinity with the goddess Vesta. They were chosen precisely because they were young enough to mold, pliable enough to be broken, and powerless enough to be reshaped into instruments of the state. In this, Rome anticipated systems that would emerge centuries later, monarchs placing children in monasteries, empires abducting indigenous youth for civilization, regimes forcing conformity through re-education camps. The methods differ, but the blueprint is the same. Seize the young, erase their past, and write obedience into their future. The brilliance and the horror of the Vestal system was its ability to convert victims into symbols of purity. Dressed in white, draped in ceremony, they projected serenity. Citizens saw devotion, not captivity. They saw sacrifice, not fear. And so, Rome succeeded in making the very image of control appear as holiness. The paradox was complete. The more thoroughly the Vestals were broken inside, the more powerful they appeared outside as icons of Rome's divine protection. But empires that rely on such contradictions plant seeds of their own unraveling. By the late Republic, scandals involving the Vestals began to shake public confidence. When priestesses were accused of impurity, the trials revealed not only supposed moral failings, but also the political manipulations behind them. Citizens whispered, if even the sacred guardians of Rome could be condemned on rumor, what did that say about the fairness of Rome's justice? If divine purity could be used as a weapon in political rivalries, what did that say about the legitimacy of Rome's gods? The institution that once reinforced Rome's stability began, in its corruption, to expose Rome's fragility. And yet, the suffering of the Vestals did not end with their service or their deaths. It lingered in memory, or rather, in the absence of memory. Rome's deliberate erasure of their names and lives left scars in history itself. To erase a name was to deny existence, to bury someone twice, once in body, once in remembrance. That is why today historians struggle to reconstruct even the most basic facts of many Vestals' lives. They were not merely punished, they were systematically forgotten. But forgetting is never complete. Every fragment that survives, a chronicler's aside, a whispered legend, a half-erased inscription, is an act of defiance against Rome's attempt at silence. Each fragment pulls these women back from the abyss of oblivion, reminding us that their humanity endured even when their empire tried to erase it. And this is where the story transcends Rome and becomes ours. Because in every age, there are those whose voices are silenced, whose names are erased, whose suffering is cloaked in noble language. To remember the Vestals is to recognize that the cost of forgetting is complicity. It is to see that monuments and rituals are never neutral. They are built on choices, and those choices often conceal the lives consumed in their making. The lesson of the Vestals is not only about Rome's cruelty, it is about vigilance. When purity becomes a tool of control, when rituals mask oppression, when individuals are turned into symbols for the sake of power, the same logic that destroyed these women's lives again. It is our responsibility to recognize it, to name it, and to resist it. Because the flame the Vestals tended was never just Rome's. It has become, through their suffering, a metaphor for memory itself. Rome sought to extinguish their identities, to bury them in darkness and silence. But their story, fragile as it is, continues to burn. And as long as we remember, the fire survives, not as a symbol of empire, but as a warning against it. The story of the Vestal virgins forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the greatest empires often conceal their darkest crimes beneath the language of faith, purity, and duty. Rome did not merely conquer through armies and legions. It conquered by shaping narratives, by convincing its people that suffering was sacred, that obedience was survival, and that silence was virtue. The Vestals embodied this illusion perfectly. They were Rome's living propaganda, draped in white, revered in public, and destroyed in private. When we strip away the ceremonial language and the marble facades, we see the mechanics of power in their rawest form. Rome understood that fear is most effective when it is invisible. Public spectacles like the burial, alive, reminded citizens of divine justice, while hidden punishments like the verberatio reminded the Vestals themselves that no sanctuary existed within the temple walls. Every element of the system reinforced the same truth. Rome's survival was built on control, and control required sacrifice. The cycle of trauma ensured the institution's longevity. A young girl taken at age 8 would grow into a woman who knew nothing but ritual and fear. By the time she completed her 30 years, she was too broken to resist and often too isolated to reintegrate into society. Some, as we've seen, returned to the temple as enforcers, perpetuating the very system that had enslaved them. In this way, Rome created not just victims but instruments of its own endurance. The cruelty became self-sustaining, replicated by those it had already destroyed. The parallels to later history are impossible to ignore. Societies across the globe have devised similar systems of ritualized captivity, from cloisters that confined women under vows of chastity to colonial powers that seized children under the guise of civilization, to modern regimes that police purity or silence dissent through ideology. The logic is identical. Take the vulnerable, isolate them, erase their past, and weaponize their identity for the state. The Vestals were not an anomaly of antiquity. They were a blueprint. And yet, the most chilling part of their story is not the cruelty itself, but how ordinary it became. To the average Roman, there was nothing unusual about Vestals being taken as children, living in isolation, or punished for impurity. It was seen as necessary for the survival of Rome. Citizens walked past the Forum, saw the Vestals in processions, and felt reassured. Few ever questioned the cost. The silence of the victims allowed the system to function unchallenged for centuries. This normalization of cruelty is what makes their story timeless, because it warns us that the gravest injustices are often those society no longer sees as injustice at all. Yet history has a way of resurrecting forgotten voices. The fragments that remain, the scratched rumors of suffocated girls, the legends of miraculous defiance, the rare accounts of broken survivors, challenge Rome's attempt at erasure. They remind us that these women were not abstractions but human beings with names, families, and dreams. They remind us that beneath every ritual lies a person, and beneath every system of control lies a life sacrificed. This remembrance carries responsibility. If we speak of the Vestals only as symbols of Rome's piety, we repeat the empire's lie. If we tell their story without acknowledging their suffering, we become complicit in their erasure. To honor them properly, we must restore what Rome denied, their humanity. They were children who played with dolls before horns of ceremony shattered their lives. They were daughters whose parents wept in silence. They were women who carried scars, emotional, physical, spiritual, that outlived their service. And in remembering them, we also confront ourselves. What rituals of our own societies conceal exploitation? What systems disguise control as tradition, sacrifice as honor, purity as holiness? The Vestals are not just a warning about the past. They are a mirror for the present. As we near the conclusion of this story, we must carry forward one final truth. Empires fall, monuments crumble, but memory endures. The flame the Vestals guarded may have burned out centuries ago, but their story continues to flicker, fragile, faint, but alive. And in that flame lies both a warning and a duty, to recognize cruelty even when it wears the mask of sanctity, and to resist systems that demand silence as the price of survival. The Empire of Rome prided itself on permanence, on roads that stretched across continents, aqueducts that carried water for centuries, and laws that formed the bedrock of Western civilization. But beneath the grandeur of these achievements lay a system that consumed the lives of the powerless, hiding its cruelty behind rituals of sanctity. The Vestal virgins are perhaps the starkest reminder that Rome's strength was built not only on conquest abroad, but also on control at home, particularly of its women and children. The true genius of the system was how thoroughly it reshaped identity. A girl taken at 8 no longer belonged to her family. She was erased and redefined as property of the goddess. Over 3 decades, her entire sense of self was bound to the sacred flame and the rituals of obedience. Even when she was released, the damage was irreversible. She was too old to marry, too stigmatized to reintegrate, too broken to find freedom in any meaningful sense. This is why their liberation was the cruelest deception of all. Rome promised freedom but delivered exile, social death, and often madness. Yet for centuries, citizens applauded this system. Why? Because they believed the sacrifices of the Vestals protected Rome itself. The girls' suffering was framed as holy service, their punishments as divine justice, their erasure as cosmic necessity. In reality, their suffering protected not the gods but the power of Rome's ruling elite. By making obedience sacred, the empire ensured its survival, and by disguising oppression as honor, it ensured silence. This silence has long outlived the empire. Historians often sanitize the story of the Vestals, emphasizing their privileges and downplaying their torments. Popular culture romanticizes them as noble priestesses rather than terrified captives. In doing so, the empire's propaganda still works centuries after its fall. That is why retelling their story matters, to strip away the illusion and confront the reality. For the Vestals were not willing saints. They were children taken by force. They were women broken by ritual. They were human beings whose suffering was sanctified and erased to maintain order. To remember them as anything less is to perpetuate the lie that Rome crafted so carefully. And yet, remembering them also means confronting uncomfortable questions about our own world. What systems today consume lives under the guise of tradition, purity, or necessity? Where do we see innocence sacrificed for stability, silence demanded in exchange for survival, human beings turned into symbols of purity or honor? The forms have changed, but the logic remains. Whether enforced labor, coerced vows, or cultural practices that erase individuality, the mechanisms echo Rome's blueprint. This is the true warning of the Vestals. Rome's cruelty was not an aberration but a pattern that resurfaces wherever power seeks to sanctify itself. When suffering is framed as holy, when obedience is dressed in white, when silence is mistaken for virtue, the victims vanish and the system endures. The challenge for us is not only to mourn the Vestals, but to recognize their story whenever it repeats. The flame they tended was said to embody Rome's eternity, but in truth, it is their suffering that endures as Rome's legacy. Their silence, their erasure, their torment, all reveal that empires are not judged solely by their monuments, but by the lives they consume to sustain them. The Colosseum still stands. The aqueducts still carry water. But the names of countless girls lie buried in unmarked earth, erased by the very civilization that celebrated itself as eternal. To tell their story now is to light a different flame, one of remembrance, not ritual. A fire that refuses erasure, that burns against the silence, that restores humanity where empire denied it. The Vestals may have been condemned to silence in life, but in memory they can speak again, not as symbols of Rome's glory, but as witnesses to its cruelty. And in their voices, faint but insistent, lies the most enduring truth, that no empire, however powerful, can escape the reckoning of memory. Rome tried to bury them in darkness. We owe them light. In the end, the Vestal virgins stand as both victims and warnings. They were victims of a system that consumed their childhoods, erased their families, and bound their lives to rituals they did not choose. But they are also warnings about the dangers of institutionalized silence, about how power thrives when cruelty is sanctified and memory is erased. Their story is not just history, it is prophecy, repeating itself whenever societies trade humanity for order. The most haunting aspect of their fate was not the brutality of their punishments, but the way those punishments were rationalized. Rome did not see itself as cruel. It saw itself as just, as pious, as chosen by the gods. The priests who gagged young women before beating them believed they were preserving sanctity. The magistrates who led girls in bridal gowns to their tombs believed they were enacting divine law. Ordinary citizens who applauded processions of condemned Vestals believed they were protecting Rome from impurity. Cruelty becomes most dangerous not when it is hidden, but when it is believed to be sacred. This is why the system endured for centuries. Rome had convinced itself that the suffering of children was necessary for the survival of the state. It is a chilling reminder of how easily civilizations can blind themselves to injustice when it is wrapped in ritual and sanctity. And it is why the story of the Vestals should never be dismissed as ancient superstition. It is a mirror, reflecting patterns that resurface again and again, systems that demand purity, obedience, and silence in exchange for belonging. Even in their silence, the Vestals resisted. Their resistance was not open rebellion but survival itself, enduring decades of trauma, finding ways to comfort one another in the shadows, preserving fragments of humanity against overwhelming erasure. And sometimes, resistance took the form of legend, like Tuccia's miraculous sieve, stories that insisted on innocence in the face of accusation. These acts, small as they were, prove that the empire never fully extinguished the flame of individuality, no matter how hard it tried. To tell their story today is to reclaim that resistance. It is to say that they were not nameless, faceless symbols of purity, but human beings whose suffering mattered. It is to light the flame Rome tried to smother, to give voice to those it silenced. And in doing so, we confront the truth that history's greatest danger is not cruelty itself, but forgetting cruelty, normalizing it, or disguising it as virtue. The ruins of Rome still stand, arches, temples, forums where Vestals once walked. Tourists marvel at the grandeur, rarely pausing to consider the lives consumed to sustain it. Yet in those stones, if we listen closely, we can hear the faint echoes of girls who once laughed with dolls before horns of ceremony tore them away. Their voices are fragile, but they endure because memory endures. The final lesson of the Vestals is simple but profound. No empire is eternal, no ritual can hide cruelty forever, no silence can erase humanity completely. Rome fell as all empires fall. Its gods are forgotten, its ceremonies dust. But the suffering of its daughters still speaks, It speaks to warn us that whenever purity is demanded at the expense of humanity, whenever obedience is sanctified and dissent erased, the pattern returns. And it speaks to remind us that our duty, across centuries, is not only to marvel at monuments, but to remember the lives buried beneath them. The flame the Vestals once guarded has long since gone out, but the fire of their story still burns, illuminating the shadows of history and warning us against repeating its darkest patterns. Their silence has become our responsibility. Their erasure has become our obligation to resist, and their suffering has become a light, not of Rome's eternity, but of humanity's duty to remember.